Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Kuehn, and yes, it's pronounced Keen. It doesn't look like it. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. In my role, I spend a lot of time talking about Azure infrastructure, and one of the big topics that I've been focusing on specifically the last year and a half has been Azure VMware Solution. And yes, a lot of people do capitalize the W. It's not capitalized. So if you want to make it seem like you know VMware, just make sure that you spell it capital V, capital M, WARE. So, if you want to connect with me as time unfolds, I tend to share a lot of good information on Twitter and LinkedIn. So these are great ways to get in touch with me. My DMs are always open as well, whether that be on LinkedIn or Twitter. So if you've got questions, you want to understand something a little bit better, feel free to connect with me and write me something if you don't want to be more public and ask me the questions online that everybody else can see. So thanks for having me, Simon. I definitely appreciate it. It's been a weird year and a half. It keeps moving longer and longer. So these virtual things are always kind of a fun reality. So let's start with the introduction and the background of the service. I think that's going to make a lot of sense here as folks become more familiar with the solution. So Azure VMware Solution delivers a comprehensive VMware environment as a service. This allows customers to run VMware native workloads exactly as they run on premises, except it's in Azure. So customers get a chance to capitalize on their existing VMware investments, skills, and tools. So all of that time customers have spent learning vCenter, vSAN, vSphere, you can take that, plug it into Azure. This option provides you with the most symmetry in terms of your on-premises workloads. So most of our customers are running the version that gets deployed with Azure VMware Solution on premises. So you get to take your existing applications and you get to have that familiar platform. And it's a great win-win for customers that have been a little hesitant to moving towards the cloud. This is essentially running VMware natively on Azure. So you've got your on-premises data center, which is comprised of vSphere, vSAN, and NSX. You connect that into Azure. The recommended pattern is to connect it with an express route circuit. You'll then deploy the software-defined data center, or SDDC. You'll get vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, NSX. And you could even think about extending what you're doing with Site Recovery Manager, or SRM. That reached general availability back in July. So if you aren't yet ready to even migrate your workloads on premises, you could think about Azure being a target for your disaster recovery environment. The minimum deployment for Azure VMware Solution is 3 dedicated bare metal nodes. Those are your dedicated servers. Nobody else has access to them. It's not logically separate like most of Azure. With that deployment comes an express route circuit. That express route circuit gets peered into an Azure VNet, and that's what gives you access to the Microsoft Azure Backbone network. Once all of this is connected, and I think the hardest part is network connectivity, you can start onboarding Azure services like Azure Active Directory, any of the Azure security services, Azure SQL Database, Azure Monitor. You can think about extending what you're doing with an application gateway or even artificial intelligence. We had a first iteration of this back in, I want to say it was late 2018, early 2019. We have since gone a different direction and we have this first party service. This reached general availability last September. And if you followed the service over the course of its lifespan at Microsoft, you'll notice that the first iteration didn't have nearly as many regional availability points. Hopefully, what you're seeing here is that Microsoft has invested in making this be a global service. All of the planned regions are available on our public website. And just note that if you are hoping for one of these planned regions to come online and maybe the date slips, that is a possibility. So just be prepared to work with your Microsoft counterparts to understand what the timetables look like if you are thinking about deploying Azure VMware Solution in one of the planned regions. Right now, if you were to deploy Azure VMware Solution, this is the software specifications and the hardware specifications. I won't spend too much time talking about it, but this shouldn't feel too foreign. Most of our customers are running this flavor of vSphere on premises. And then in terms of the hardware specification, we only have one SKU at the present time. This could always evolve and change. It's going to be an interesting service as the entire ecosystem sort of pivots and looks at embracing this as a way to speed up transformation. So the actual nodes themselves are hyper-converged nodes. And so you're getting massive compute and massive resources to be able to run your workloads in Azure. The big part of this slide, though, I want to call out at the bottom. There's a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster. You can't go lower than that. There's a maximum of 96 or sorry, a maximum of 12 clusters per private cloud, a maximum of 16 nodes per vSphere cluster, and then a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure private cloud instance. Hopefully you're seeing that we can think about a lot of different types of scale, and you can scale up and scale down on demand. Let's spend some time talking about the deployment process next. So right now, you will deploy the private cloud in Azure. It's just like a lot of other Azure resources. In fact, I've got a video demo that walks through this. You'll create a VNet, and then you'll create an Azure Bastion and a jump host. You could always create a jump host with a public IP that has just in time as well. Bastion is not in every single region. Just note that you will need some sort of way to access the web GUI once Azure VMware Solution deploys. So you'll create a gateway subnet in that VNet, and this is to link that express route circuit into your Azure VNet. And after deployment, you'll link that SDDC to the VNet. From there, you'll connect to the jump host behind the Azure Bastion service, or you'll enable just in time to get into that server. You'll connect to the vCenter environment. Then you'll connect to the NSXT environment. Those credentials are registered with Azure. You're not putting a password in. That's all done via automation by way of deploying the service. You'll next enable global reach for on-premises access. So the recommended pattern, and we'll talk about this, is to have your express route circuit on-premises peered into Azure, and then you've got an express route circuit that's peered into Azure, and you'll enable global reach to handle traffic routing between those two environments. The last thing you'll want to do is you'll want to join the domain, and you'll want to configure your identity source. And that is done right now with a support ticket into Microsoft, just because of the fact that you don't technically have access to the root of your ESXi hosts. So let's talk about network architecture, because I've hinted that it's probably the hardest thing to wrap your head around. So there's two types of connectivity models with Azure VMware Solution. There's basic interconnectivity, which is what is shown on the slide. This is what happens when you deploy the Azure VMware Solution service. The express route circuit gets deployed, and you have a virtual network, and then you link the express route circuit into the Azure VNet. This is what helps you integrate with Azure native services. And sometimes customers don't need that hybrid connectivity right away as well. So this is what's called basic interconnectivity. The networking is interesting. So there is a management network that Azure VMware Solution only leans on, and it should be a non-overlapping IP address with your Azure VNet as well as on-premises. It's just like extending your network connectivity if you were moving everything into IaaS. So the management network itself, it requires a minimum of a /22 CIDR address block. You can always make that bigger. The recommended pattern, though, is just to make sure that nothing overlaps. And then the corresponding Azure VNet won't be an overlapping IP address space, and it'll have to have that gateway subnet to terminate the express route circuit into that Azure VNet. Then there's full interconnectivity. And this is what I've talked about, right? The idea that you need your express route circuit from on-premises to connect into Azure, and then you need your express route circuit from Azure VMware Solution to be peered into an Azure VNet. When you enable global reach, that's a fully supported SLA-backed guarantee from a migration pattern. So if you need to migrate VMs from on-premises all the way into Azure, you will need that express route circuit if it's a production-based environment. I think one of the biggest caveats here is in the next slide. There is an opportunity to set up a site-to-site VPN using a vWAN hub. Now, the vWAN hub does the same thing that the global reach will do. It'll handle east-west traffic routing. The big piece here, though, is if you are migrating production workloads and something happens and you call Microsoft for support, VMware might be engaged, and VMware will ask almost immediately, is there an express route circuit? So we always stress that this is something you can do for testing before the express route circuit shows up, because sometimes that takes some time. Or you could, if you just need hybrid connectivity, this could be a recommended pattern as well. When it comes to the migration side of things, let's walk through those steps. So you'll want to first assess your VMware environment, and you can do that now with Azure Migrate. That reached general availability right around the Ignite timeframe of this year. That will help you identify the workloads to migrate. A lot of times customers don't know what they have. They've given folks access to build up servers at will, and nobody really knows what's showing up. So there's a lot of sprawl on premises. Once you have that assessment, once you've identified the workloads, you can define the migration approach. There's a product that VMware uses called HCX. This is the Swiss Army knife of migration. This is what handles the vMotioning of a VM from on-premises all the way into Azure VMware Solution. And HCX supports live, bulk, or cold migration. Most customers pick live, especially if it's a production-based workload, because it's minimal downtime. But if you do get a change window, or maybe there's a dev environment that you need to move over and it's not on all the time, those two patterns are also supported. This helps you identify the steps to full production, and then that enables you to move to the proof of concept side of things. This is where you create the private cloud. You move a few VMs using the preferred migration type, and you sort of build up that familiarity as to what Azure VMware Solution looks like in terms of Azure. This then helps you transition to production. So there's the at-scale migration and adoption, right? So once everything's up, once you've vetted everything, everything's been tested, everything's been deployed, you can start to think about migrating those VMs pretty readily. And if you don't have the cycles, Microsoft does have Fast Track, and we've got a partner ecosystem that requires certification from Microsoft each year to be able to work with partners, or well, not work with partners, work with customers to migrate VMs into Azure VMware Solution. So let's talk a little bit about management and support next, because I think that's where a number of questions still show up. So oftentimes we see the shared responsibility matrix for IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. This is the shared responsibility matrix for Azure VMware Solution. Hopefully what you're seeing here in the slide is that a lot of the burden of responsibility falls on Microsoft. So you're no longer getting the pages or the emails at 2 a.m. when your power supply fails. That's usually when it likes to fail, 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. You don't have to worry about patching your ESXi hosts. You don't have to worry about upgrading the hosts. You don't have to worry about physical security. Microsoft is focusing on that for you. This frees up your engineering cycles so you can focus on things like lifecycle management for VMs. So if you've got older OSs still in your environment, this allows your engineers to start thinking about what an upgrade path would look like to move to a newer OS. You could even think about bringing on configuration management. A lot of customers, because they are doing the full gambit of support related to their VMware environments on premises, when they transition that burden of responsibility or a good chunk of that burden of responsibility over to Microsoft, they can start to figure out what it would take to bring into consideration configuration management. So the support structure is also cool here. If you are running Azure VMware Solution and you run into a problem, you are only calling Microsoft. So Microsoft becomes that point, that central point of support and escalation. Microsoft troubleshoots all of the Azure native components. Is it something with networking? Is it something with access to the portal, right? Once that has been determined that it's not an Azure specific issue, Microsoft, on behalf of you, will go to VMware and open up a ticket with VMware. You don't have to open up a ticket on your behalf with VMware. So then Microsoft continues to sort of play point until you reach full resolution in your environment. One of the coolest things here is talking through integrations. So I often say it's like achievement unlocked when you have your Azure VMware Solution environment sit so much closer to the ARM APIs. These are some of the popular Azure VMware Solution integrations at the moment. So Azure NetApp Files for file share. Then there's the blob storage components. So if you're familiar with content libraries and templatizing your VMs, you can have that live on an Azure Blob Storage account, which is kind of cool. You don't have to move any of that to the vSAN data store, because once you deploy this, you get a vSAN data store, and that's a finite resource, right? Unless you add additional nodes. Then there's iSCSI disk pools, which is in public preview. So it's another way to expand what you're doing related to your storage footprint. So if you don't have to worry about adding an additional node, if you just need additional storage for a short period of time, you could think about using iSCSI disk pools. Then we've got a lot of customers who are looking at Azure Traffic Manager and Application Gateway just for highly available, highly resilient applications. That's hard to do if your environment lives on premises. In fact, I don't think it's possible. So having your Azure VMware Solution VMs sit closer to the ARM APIs is impactful in the sense that you can make use of these Azure native services that don't cost a lot of money just to spin up and to make use of. There's support for hub and spoke. So if you've got hub and spoke already deployed in your environment, you can extend what you're doing into Azure VMware Solution, and that would just trickle into what you're doing from your full-blown enterprise scale digital transformation. Then there's the Microsoft Azure Backup Server. One thing to mention here too is there's a number of third-party backup solutions that are also available at the moment. So Commvault, Veritas, Rubrik, Veeam, I'm sure I'm missing one. There's about 4 or 5 of them that are now certified, with more that are going through certification process right now with Microsoft. So you can either use Microsoft Azure Backup Server to back up your VMs, just like if they lived on premises and you were using Microsoft Azure Backup Server, or you can lean on some of the third-party solutions that might already be in your environment. You can onboard Azure Monitor, as well as Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. So I think these are also awesome, because a lot of times folks don't know what they have. They don't know the security posture of their environment. So being able to onboard and expand what you're doing from a security perspective alone helps a lot of customers out with making sure that everything's baselined correctly and configured correctly. In terms of the resources, because I always like to leave folks with a lot of good info, a lot of customers and a lot of folks that I've talked to always ask about hands-on. Well, it's a hard service to do hands-on with. So Microsoft partnered up with VMware to create hands-on labs. Now, if you're familiar with VMware's hands-on labs, it requires a registration, and then you're able to go get familiarity with whatever service you're looking for. Doesn't have to be just Azure VMware Solution, but Azure VMware Solution has a couple of hands-on labs at the moment. These are click-through guided tutorials that help you figure out how to use the service and configure everything correctly. The first 2 labs deal with private cloud deployment and connectivity. So you'll go through the notion of building out the Azure VMware Solution environment and then connecting it into an Azure VNet. And then the other lab deals with onboarding HCX, because remember, that's the piece that migrates everything, and establishing a site pairing from on-premises into Azure, and then migrating VMs. So that's the recommended pattern in terms of being able to migrate VMs from on-premises all the way into Azure. There's a number of ways if that doesn't work out, because usually some customers get to that point where they realize HCX is not going to work with them for whatever reason. There are a number of other ways you can get VMs into Azure VMware Solution, but the recommended pattern to follow until there's something that doesn't work right is HCX. So this lab is really helpful in that aspect. Microsoft also authored a Learn Path. I authored 2 of these 3 modules. So these are great ways to understand everything you have to factor in related to planning. So the first module deals with what is Azure VMware Solution, helps somebody out with the value proposition. Why would you bring this into an environment? And it helps you understand how it's positioned, how you could position it with your company, and hopefully onboard it into your environment. The next module deals with deployment. So it's all of the prereqs that you have to factor in from a networking perspective, from a subscription perspective, from a whitelisting perspective. So in order to onboard the service, you have to whitelist a subscription, and then you're able to onboard the environment into your subscription. So a lot of these different components are covered in that deployment module. And then it'll walk you through what a deployment looks like. It'll have you walk through and deploy the Azure VMware Solution environment, connect it into an Azure VNet, and then you're ready to go for the third module, which deals with HCX. So that walks through the same sort of prereqs required to establish a site pairing from on-premises into Azure over your express route circuit, and then what it looks like to migrate a VM from on-premises into Azure. So I want to walk through the demo next, and I want to add a couple of caveats here. So Azure VMware Solution does take about 3.5 to 4 hours to deploy. So rather than keep you on here for 3.5 to 4 hours when we've already been live for a little over 3, I sped some of this up. So I wanted to show you what it was like to build out Azure VMware Solution, how you build it out in the portal. So this is a great little video demo, and I will just kind of guide what's happening with my voice. So you'll want to go look for the Azure VMware Solution environment. And then once it shows up here, nothing's been deployed, right? So you can go and you can click Create at the top. You can click Create Private Cloud in that blue box. Doesn't really matter. It'll take you to the prereqs page. So if you somehow missed the prereqs, let's say you just decided you were going to go to deploy it, this would at least take you to where it shows up in our documentation, right? So if you didn't take a look at the hands-on labs or the Learn module, this would help you out. So you need an EA agreement or a CSP agreement, and then a valid non-overlapping site or address block. And the recommended pattern is that it's a minimum of /22. It could always be bigger if it needs to be. So it's just like a lot of other Azure resources, right? Tie it to an Azure resource group, give it a name. My specific environment lives in North Central. And then you'll go down here to select the host. Again, there's only one SKU, so it's the AV36 node. And then you'll supply the CIDR address block. And I picked 10.5.0.0. However, I mistyped it in the demo, but it always works out just fine. And then you can go in and you can add some tags. So tags are a big part of folks related to cost management and chargeback. You can add tags into your Azure VMware solution environment. Then once you're done, you can select review and create. And we'll go through the validation process. Before you hit create, you can always go down and evaluate all of the settings you had configured. This is always helpful because it does take, like I said, about 4 hours to deploy. If anything wound up getting missed, you can just hit previous and course correct and fix that before you deploy. So then it's as simple as hitting create, which I don't know if you're like me, that's a very easier reality than having to build out vCenter, VMware environments on premises, right? So in a matter of 4-ish hours, you'll have 3 nodes, a number of servers that are involved in the environment, and everything's up and functional, right? So all of that was abstracted for you behind the Azure Resource Manager portal. So you see over here on the right, all of the 10.5.0.0, that wound up getting carved out by the automation. I just supplied that CIDR address block. And you'll know it worked because you'll see succeeded. So while this is building, it'll say building. So when it says succeeded, this is where you need to go in and you need to now connect the express route circuit into the Azure VNet. So this is a brand new screen. What you wind up doing is you need to have that virtual network that has a gateway subnet. You can create a brand new one, or in my demo, I already have a VNet with a subnet created. You'll select that, and it's a matter of going up to the top and hitting save. And then a number of automation components get kicked off. So go to the same kind of deployment overview. And then you'll get a bunch of things, like you'll get the VNet gateway, the local connection point, the express route, auth key, etc. And you'll know it worked because you'll go down to the connectivity section underneath manage. You'll go to the express route section, and you will see that an auth key has been created and used to connect your express route circuit into an Azure VNet. So this demo encompasses basic interconnectivity. There's more involved if you need to figure out how to deploy this with your on-premises environments. And if you get to that point, you can always reach out. You can always talk to your Microsoft counterparts. There's a number of teams available at this point in time to help you realize the value of this journey. And that is the end of what I have to share today. So thank you for the opportunity, Simon. I definitely appreciate it.